On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning. Just as a troop of baboons exhibit cooperative and even self-sacrificial behavior because natural selection has determined it to be advantageous in the struggle for survival, so their primate cousins, Homo sapiens, exhibit similar behavior for precisely the same reason. As a result of socio-biological pressures, there has evolved among Homo sapiens a sort of herd morality which is useful in the perpetuation of our species. But on the atheistic view, there doesn't seem to be anything about Homo sapiens that makes this morality objectively true. Philosopher of science Michael Roos reports, the position of the modern evolutionist is that humans have an awareness of morality because such an awareness is of biological worth. Morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. If we were to rewind the film of human evolution back to the beginning and start anew, people with a very different set of moral values might well have evolved. As Darwin himself wrote in The Descent of Man, if men were reared under precisely the same conditions as bees, there can hardly be a doubt that our unmarried females would, like the worker bees, think it a sacred duty to kill their brothers, and mothers would strive to kill their fertile daughters, and no one would think of interfering. For us to think that human beings are special and our morality objectively true is to succumb to the temptation to speciesism, an unjustifiable bias in favor of our own species. The objective worthlessness of human beings on a naturalistic worldview is underscored by two implications of that worldview: materialism and determinism. Naturalists are typically materialists or physicalists who regard man as merely an animal organism. But if man has no immaterial aspect to his being, whether you call it soul or mind or whatever, then we're not qualitatively different from other animal species. On a materialistic anthropology, there's no reason to think that human beings are objectively more valuable than rats. When a terrorist bomb rips through a market in Baghdad, all that really happens is just a rearrangement of the molecules that used to be a little girl. Secondly, if there is no mind distinct from the brain, then everything we think and do is determined by the input of our five senses and our genetic makeup. There is no personal agent who freely decides to do something. But without freedom, none of our choices is morally significant. They're like the jerks of a puppet's limbs, controlled by the strings of sensory input and physical constitution. And what moral value does a puppet or its movements have? Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. If there is no God, then any basis for regarding the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens as objectively true seems to have been removed. Take God out of the picture, and all you seem to be left with is an ape-like creature on a tiny speck of dust, beset with delusions of moral grandeur.
For many, one of the most troubling questions in the Bible is, why did God command the literal extermination of entire nations in the Old Testament? This is Reasonable Faith with Dr. William Lane Craig. I'm Kevin Harris, and today Dr. Craig will take this question head on. This issue is commonly referred to as the Atrocities of the Old Testament, and skeptics often use it as an indictment against the morality of the God of the Bible. Today, straightforward answers from Dr. William Lane Craig. And I want to remind you that there are many resources just like this podcast available at reasonablefaith.org. Transcripts and recordings of Dr. Craig's debates on college campuses around the world, articles, questions and answers, a discussion forum, and much more. Available now at reasonablefaith.org. Dr. Craig, a roadblock to faith in Christ and to Christianity is something that is often called the atrocities of the Old Testament. And that is when we read the Old Testament account of God's using Israel to judge other nations, literally wiping them out, women, children, animals. People say, how could God do that? How could God commit genocide in that way? How could he take the lives of little children and so on? And we do find, in fact, these stories in the Old Testament. Have you run into that objection?
Oh, yes. And it's one I think that any thoughtful Christian feels himself wholly apart from confronting skeptics. No thoughtful Christian can read these narratives and not find them disturbing, Kevin. I think this is one of the most difficult questions that a Bible-believing Christian faces. How could God command soldiers to go in and kill innocent women and children?
Now, when we look at this, the first thing I guess we would try to determine is, what is the context of these events? So what are some contextual considerations?
Well, I think, first of all, it's important to realize that this is a singular event in the Old Testament. This is not the normal way in which the God of the Old Testament operates. Contrary to what certain people might tell you, the God of the Old Testament is not some sort of moral monster who goes about commanding people to kill women and children. It's the very singularity of these narratives that makes them stand out. These killings tend to be associated with the conquest of the land of Canaan. It's when God calls Israel out of Egypt and now gives them the promised land. And living in this land at that time are certain clans or small nations or tribal groups that are collectively called the Canaanites. There were probably about 7 of these different clans. And what God commands Joshua and the armies of Israel to do is to go in and wipe out these Canaanite peoples, to kill every man, woman, and child, so that the Canaanites will be literally annihilated. And in this way, God gives the land over to Israel as their promised land, their dwelling place. This was the land that Abraham was called to originally, and then Israel went down into Egypt during the time of famine, and were there for around 400 years or so before now God calls them back out to the promised land to give it to them again, but that means wiping out these peoples that are already living there.
Right off the bat, it seems to go against the grain of our modern sensibilities.
Oh, yeah, I certainly think so, because we have in modern warfare a distinction between civilians and combatants, and it seems morally atrocious to kill these women and children who are non-combatants. And so it does present, I think, a real difficulty for the Christian in reading these narratives. Especially, as I say, what's odd is that it's so different from God as you read about him in the rest of the Old Testament, where he's compassionate toward those who are suffering, the downtrodden, the oppressed. He's fair in dealing with other people. He even loves pagan nations. I mean, one of the most remarkable stories in the Old Testament is the story of Jonah, where God sends a prophet to Nineveh, this pagan nation, because he says there are a couple of 100,000 people there who don't know their right hand from their left, and I have pity upon these people. So he sends a prophet to them, even though they're not even Israelites. And so it's so strange to see this narrative in the conquest of Canaan of this same God who is so compassionate and loving and just, ordering these Israeli soldiers to annihilate these people groups in Canaan.
One thing that emerges from this question is that it's an internal question. The question, as the skeptic usually presents it against the Christian, is, why would God do this?
Yeah.
And you immediately think, well, wait a minute, if it were God who were doing this, we're talking about the God of the universe here. So it becomes an internal question of why God would do this, as opposed to, is there a God who did this?
Exactly. I think that's right, Kevin. And if you ask yourself, suppose this objection is unanswerable. Suppose the skeptic is able to demonstrate to our satisfaction that an all-loving, all-just God could not have issued such a command. What follows from that? That Christ didn't rise from the dead? That Jesus Christ was not God incarnate? That God does not exist? Well, no, obviously none of that would follow. All that would follow is that God, in fact, did not give such a command as you have recorded in the book of Genesis. Now, that would mean either these stories are simply legends, perhaps myths of the founding of Israel that never really occurred, or else, if these events did occur, then Israel, carried away in a fit of national frenzy, thought God is on our side, and so they imagined that God had commanded them to do these things. In other words, what this objection is really an attack on is not the existence of God or the truth of Christianity. It's an attack on the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. Now, that's important, I think, but nevertheless, it's not central to the truth of Christianity. If one were forced to, one could give up the doctrine of biblical inerrancy and say, all right, I guess God really didn't issue these commands after all, for one reason or another. But nevertheless, I still believe God exists. I still believe in the incarnation of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, and so forth. So it's not an objection to the existence of God or the resurrection of Jesus or anything like that. What it really is it's a type of criticism of biblical inerrancy.
At most, it would harm the doctrine of inerrancy, but not Christianity itself.
Right. That's the point that I'm trying to make, is that it's important to see what's at stake in this objection, lest we think the objection proves something that it doesn't. It has nothing to do with whether or not God exists, or whether or not he brought Israel out of Egypt, or whether Christ was born of a virgin or fed the 5,000 or any of those things. It's really an attack upon the accuracy of the Genesis account of the conquest of Canaan. And what's ironic about this is that a lot of critical scholars think that, in fact, these aren't historical stories. A lot of critical scholars think that these are just legendary stories that were invented about the national founding of Israel, sort of like the legends of the founding of Rome by Romulus and Remus, and therefore these events never really happened. So for those kind of liberal scholars, this isn't even a problem. The problem doesn't arise because they don't believe God ever gave such commands. They think these are just, in a sense, myths or legends. So while I don't agree with that perspective, I think it helps us to put the objection in perspective. This is not an objection that strikes at the heart of theism or even Christianity. It would attack simply the accuracy of the Pentateuch with respect to the conquest of Canaan.
Now, in the event that one would want to go internally as well and say, God could have had good reasons for this judgment against these pagan nations, what are our options on that?
Well, I think first we need to set the framework of a theory of ethics that will help us to understand these commands. And the framework for my ethical theory is what's called divine command morality. Now, what is that? Well, that is an ethical theory which says that our moral duties are constituted by God's commands. It is God's commandments to us that give us right and wrong, that determine what we should and should not do. And therefore, if God issues you a command to do something, that becomes your moral duty, and it would be wrong for you not to do it. Now, since God doesn't issue commands to himself, he doesn't have any moral duties to fulfill. Rather, he simply acts in accordance with his nature, which is loving, just, kind, compassionate, and so forth. Now, in that context, what one comes to realize is that God is under no obligation whatsoever to extend anybody's life. Life is a gift from God, and he's not duty-bound to prolong your life. He can take your life as he sees fit. That's his prerogative as God. So I don't have the right as a human being to kill somebody else. If I did that, that would be murder. But if God were to kill me right now, that wouldn't be murder. He could do that, and he wouldn't violate any moral duty. That's within his prerogatives. Now, what that means in this case is that God isn't under any moral obligation to prolong the lives of the Canaanite people, even the Canaanite children. Children die all the time in the world from disease and accident and other sorts of things. So God isn't in any way obligated to prolong the lives of any of these Canaanite persons. If he chooses to take their lives, he does no wrong and is completely within his rights in doing so. So the problem isn't that God took the lives of the Canaanites. That's not really a difficulty. The difficulty, rather, is that he commanded the Israeli soldiers to take the lives of these Canaanites. That is, I think, the essence of the problem.
And if God were all-knowing and he had the attributes of omniscience and so forth, it wouldn't be an arbitrary thing. He would have a purpose.
Yes, that's right. God is
in taking a life.
His commands reflect his own moral nature and character, which is just and loving and wise, so that his commands are not issued capriciously or arbitrarily. There would be good, morally sufficient reasons for issuing a command like this. And if God were to issue a command to the soldiers to kill the Canaanite people, in virtue of divine command morality, that would become their moral duty. That would become the right thing for them to do. Now, someone might say, well, then are you saying that God can command someone to murder somebody else? Is that what you're saying? No, I'm not saying that God can command you to murder someone. I'm saying that God can command you to do something which, in the absence of a divine command, would have been murder, but is not murder in virtue of that divine command, because it now becomes your moral duty. God has the right to command you to do things which, in the absence of a command, would have been sin. So think of Abraham's sacrifice of his son Isaac. If Abraham had done this on his own initiative, if he had just taken his son and decided to sacrifice him to God, that would have been an abomination in God's sight. But under the injunction of a divine command to sacrifice Isaac, it is no longer murder. It now becomes Abraham's moral duty, and God tests Abraham to see his faithfulness and obedience if he will carry out this terribly difficult command in obedience to God. So God gave a command to these Israeli soldiers to do something that they would not have had the right to do under their own initiative, namely to take the lives of not only soldiers, other soldiers, but also civilians, women, and children. And moreover, I think we want to say that God had a morally sufficient reason for doing so. And we see this already in the book of Genesis. In the book of Genesis, when Abraham is confronted by God, and God is about to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, you remember there's a story where Abraham bargains with God, and he says, what if there are 50 righteous people in the city? Will you destroy it in that case? Won't the judge of all the earth do right? He challenges God with respect to God doing the right thing. And what is God's response? He says, if there are 50 righteous people in the city, I will not destroy it. And then Abraham says, oh God, don't blame me. What if there are 40 people? And God said, I still won't destroy it if there are 40 people. And Abraham says, oh Lord, don't think me impertinent. What if there are even 10 righteous people in the city? And God says, if there are 10 righteous in the city, I will not destroy it. And Abraham doesn't dare go any lower than that. He's too afraid to bargain with God more. But this story sets the background for the destruction of the conquest of Canaan. It shows that God isn't going to destroy a nation or a people without just cause, that if there were righteous people there, he wouldn't do it. And when he predicts the bondage of Israel in Egypt, he says to Abraham that his descendants are going to go down into Egypt, and they're going to be there for 400 years because, God says, the iniquity of the Canaanites is not yet complete. In other words, they had not yet become so corrupted, so decadent, that they were ripe for judgment. And so God stays his judgment upon Canaan for another 400 years. He allows his own people, Israel, to languish in slavery in Egypt until the iniquity of the Canaanites becomes so intolerable, so irrevocable, that now they are ripe for judgment. And he brings his people out of Israel in the Exodus and commands them to go in and destroy this nation wholesale in judgment. And in fact, the Canaanite nation and culture was incredibly decadent. They practiced temple prostitution in their worship of Baal. They even practiced child sacrifice, where they were killing innocent human beings, supposedly in worship to God. And God says, these things are abominable. I want you to wipe out these people. So this isn't just sort of making room for God's people to come back into the land. Rather, these people were ripe for judgment, and so God decided to destroy them. Now, you might say, well, what about the children, though? You know, the children hadn't done anything wrong, so how could God command them to be destroyed? Well, here I think, Kevin, we need to look at the destruction of the Canaanite children in the wider context of God's commandments to Israel not to assimilate to pagan nations and practices. God gave Israel an incredibly complex law that distinguishes between clean and unclean. And some of these regulations are so bizarre to us as moderns, like don't wear cloth that's a mixture of linen and wool, or don't have milk and meat cooked in the same vessel. The point of these strange and arbitrary distinctions between clean and unclean seems to be to avoid mixing things together. These are parables, as it were. They are living illustrations, tangible illustrations of how you are not to assimilate to these pagan nations and peoples all around you. And so the destruction of the Canaanites wholesale, even the children, is just one more terrible, tangible object lesson of the prohibition of not assimilating. They are not even to assimilate racially with these Canaanite children by allowing them to live, grow up, and intermarry with Israelis. Israel is to be reserved for God alone, set apart from him alone, and not to in any way assimilate to the peoples and nations around them. So God has them even take the lives of the children to prevent this. Now, notice that in doing so, God doesn't do anything wrong to those children. In fact, if you believe in the salvation of infants, as I do, the destruction of these children was in fact their salvation. It means that they went to heaven and went to be with God. So he
certainly spared them the rigors of the horrors of paganism.
Yeah. What if they'd grown up in that Canaanite culture and then ultimately go to hell? And so...
But at any rate, it's God's call.
Right. It's God's prerogative as the divine lawgiver, and he can command people to do things that in the absence of a command would have been sin, but in the presence of a command is now their duty. He does so with good moral reason, but also he doesn't wrong the children. I mean, I think that's important to see. He does no wrong to them in doing this. On the contrary, it accords them salvation, eternal life, and a knowledge of God. So in killing the Canaanites, God doesn't do wrong by anybody concerned. He doesn't wrong the adults because they were corrupt and ripe for judgment. He doesn't wrong the children because they get eternal life. If anybody is wronged by this, paradoxically, and I've not seen anybody else make this point, it would seem to be the Israeli soldiers themselves who would seem to be wronged, because one could think of the brutalizing effect on them of having to go and kill women and children. That you would think what a horrible, brutalizing effect that would have upon these soldiers.
Yes.
And yet, that again is looking at it from a modern, Christianized perspective. In the ancient Near East, life was already brutal. I mean, this kind of thing went on all the time. Violence and war and slaughter was commonplace.
Death.
Oh, violent death, gruesome. So we mustn't overemphasize, I think, the difficulty this would have been for the soldiers who carried it out. And moreover, I think there could be no more sobering object lesson of this fact again, that God is holy and you are called to be holy and separate. And this notion again of not assimilating, of being separate from them, would have been driven into the minds and the hearts of these Israelis by seeing what happened to these Canaanite peoples. And God said, if you are not obedient, if you apostatize, the same thing is going to happen to you. You will be judged. And eventually, centuries later, God did judge his own people by Babylon and Assyria when they came in and killed and deported the people. So this was a sobering, deep object lesson to them about the importance of maintaining covenant with Yahweh, with God, and being separate from the pagan practices and peoples around them.
Dr. Craig, as we conclude, you've answered this in all your comments that we've just heard, but I want to bring it out and just make sure that we all get this. And that is, when you hear a news report of a woman who kills her children in modern times and claims that God told her to do that, why do we have reason to doubt that that was God commanding her to drown her children in the bathtub, as occurred in Houston, Texas?
Right. I think a person like that is psychologically deranged, and a psychologist could tell that. There are not the justifying circumstances in that case that there were, for example, in the conquest of Canaan. And that's why you don't have this repeated over and over again in the Old Testament. The conquest of Canaan was a unique set of historical circumstances that obtained at that time, and is not meant to be a sort of general rule of behavior among mankind.
Now, if you are interested in biblical ethics, I want to highly recommend Paul Copan's new book, Is God a Moral Monster?, which examines those passages in the Hebrew Bible in light of the ancient Near East, and I can guarantee you it will be a very enlightening and interesting read.
Let me read from Deuteronomy 20, verses 16 to 18. This is probably one of the key texts that is mentioned in this regard. Only the cities of these people that the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, you shall not leave alive anything that breathes. But you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite and the Amorite, the Canaanite and the Perizzite, the Hivite and the Jebusite, as the Lord your God has commanded you, in order that they may not teach you to do according to all their detestable things which they have done for their gods, so that you would sin against the Lord your God. Richard Dawkins talks about this passage in his book, The God Delusion, and he mentions this in reference to ethnic cleansing. He refers to those bloodthirsty massacres carried out with xenophobic relish, that is, hatred toward outsiders. Well, let me just make a few introductory comments here. As we look at the Canaanites, we're not saying that they are the worst specimens of humanity that ever existed or that even were around in the ancient Near East. The act that God commanded was unique and unrepeatable. It was not to set a precedent for warfare throughout Israel's existence. Indeed, it does not set a precedent. Just historically, Israelites did not take this as a pretext for future wars in their history. Even so, God, we're told in Genesis 15, waited patiently for the sin of the Amorite to be filled up, for it to be ripened. God allowed Israel to go through slavery in Egypt in order for them to wait until the time when the sin of the Canaanites was ripe and ready to be judged. So this is a 400-year wait that we are talking about. And so God, in doing this, accomplished two things. He brought judgment upon Canaanites, a kind of corporate capital punishment, but the destruction was directed less against Canaanite persons as it was against Canaanite religion. The Canaanite gods and goddesses engaged in all kinds of sexual acts, including incest and bestiality, and not surprising, worshippers of these deities engaged in ritual prostitution, not to mention infant sacrifice and other deviant acts. In our sex-saturated culture, a lot of people don't seem all that concerned about sexual immorality and the destruction that it wreaks on individuals, families, and society. People might get upset about racism, about gender discrimination, but our moral instincts are often jaded when it comes to such soul-destroying activities as adultery and prostitution. God's anger at society's moral and spiritual suicide mission is in this context, God is saying enough. And actually, God's bringing judgment is a sign of his moral concern. Secondly, God is able to prepare a land for his people to create the proper religious setting to make sense out of a coming Messiah who would bring redemption to the Israelites, Jews, and also Gentiles. God promised Abraham that he would be the means of blessing to all the families of the earth in Genesis 12:3. Who are the intended recipients of salvation? Jews, yes, but also Israel's most hostile enemies. We see in the Old Testament Assyria and Egypt are mentioned as God's people in Isaiah chapter 19. Babylon and Philistia are also included in this. What's more, even the Canaanites are incorporated into the new Israel, the true people of God. In the Psalms as well as in Zechariah 9:6, the Jebusite who has been assimilated into Israel is part of the people of God. So the killing of the Canaanites, let's just put it out on the table, is not racially motivated, but rather theologically and morally motivated. So it is not at all to be understood as genocide by a long shot. Now what I'd like to do is point out a few kind of bullet points here to go through to put into perspective what these commands are all about. The typical, I'll talk first about infiltration, internal struggle, and conquest. The typical Sunday school version of the Canaanite story assumes a military engagement that was the only means of taking the land. Many evangelical scholars, however, reject this military-only model. They recognize that the biblical text refers to some type of infiltration, that it is a gradual process that is taking place here, and that there is an internal struggle that we see in Judges 1 and 2. The Canaanites continued to live in the land. The biblical text makes that clear. One Old Testament scholar, David Howard at Bethel University, he says, or Bethel Seminary, he says that we see more than a simple conquest model, but rather a mixed picture of success and failure, sudden victory, and slow, compromised progress. He said that the Israelites entered Canaan, and they did engage militarily, but without causing extensive material destruction. So we can't simply consider this a matter of the Canaanite conquest. In fact, archaeologically speaking, what we see is a gradual infiltration and an assimilation over several centuries, at the end of which point Yahweh is the recognized national name. It takes a while to get to that point. And when we look at the archaeology, we don't see just a dramatic overrunning of the Canaanite cities and destroying them. We actually see an assimilation, a moving into homes. There is not the destruction that our minds often conjure up as we read the biblical text. But as we read it more closely, we see that this is indeed not happening because there is internal struggle, that there are a lot of Canaanites still left standing. Another bullet point has to do with the ancient Near Eastern warfare rhetoric. And I think this is very, very critical for us to understand. Any conquest of Canaan is going to be far less widespread and harsh than many people assume. Let me give you a text here, and then we'll unpack it. Joshua 10:40. It says, "Thus Joshua struck all the land, the hill country and the Negev, and the lowland and the slopes and all their kings. He left no survivor. He utterly destroyed all who breathed, just as the Lord, the God of Israel, had commanded." So we think, nobody's left standing. Nobody's left behind. It's a total obliteration, right? No. Ancient Near Eastern rhetoric suggests that you could win by a very narrow margin and still talk about slaughtering your enemies, not leaving alive anything that breathed. In fact, one king of Moab, we have an inscription of what he depicted. And he said that Israel, after a battle that they had had, is no more. Israel is no more. Well, we know that was quite the exaggeration. Israel continued to go on and to varying degrees survived and even flourished. But we don't see anything resembling Israel is no more as being literally true. In fact, as we look at the biblical text, we see that Joshua, the language of Joshua, is one that talks about nations that still remain among you. At the end of Joshua, he's talking about these nations that still remain among you. He talks about not leaving any survivor, but then he talks as though there are lots of Canaanites around. And we go on to read in Judges, that says they could not drive out the Jebusites. They did not take possession. They did not drive them out completely. God says, "I will not drive them out before you." In fact, these nations remained to this day. By the time of writing, they were still around. So what is going on here? You have very strong language that says, leave alive, or we left alive nothing that breathed. But on the other hand, you've got lots of Canaanites still around. Really, it illustrates that the notion of the gradual assimilation, infiltration, and so forth makes better sense than talking about a total conquest model. Now, as I said before, that God was interested more in destroying Canaanite religion than God was interested in destroying Canaanites. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, it's interesting, you see this very nicely juxtaposed, where at first God begins by telling them to utterly destroy the Canaanites, and then it goes on to say, and do not intermarry with them. Do not worship their gods. Do not make treaties with them. Well, what's going on? Did God intend that they be wiped out? Or does God have something more fundamental here in mind? Namely, don't get pulled down by Israelite religion and morality. God is more interested in destroying Canaanite religion than in Canaanite peoples. Now, some people will say, well, maybe that's the case there, but what about the Amalekites? In 1 Samuel 15, you have Saul, who is criticized. In fact, his kingship is taken from him because of his disobedience to God, and he disobeys God because he has not, apparently, wiped out every last Amalekite, because he leaves King Agag standing. And so Samuel, when he comes in 1 Samuel 15, he ends up thrusting King Agag, the Amalekite king, through. And you think, okay, well, now all the Amalekites are gone, right? Wrong. There are lots of Amalekites still around. But I thought Saul did the job on all the Amalekites. He did everything except kill the king, and okay, he let some animals around too, but that was it. Well, no, this is again typical military language that often engages in hyperbole and rhetoric. Even when it uses language of man, woman, young and old, that doesn't at all preclude the notion that there are actually women and children there. In fact, we'll talk about this later, there's very strong reason to talk about the target being combatants rather than non-combatants in this warfare. So as we look at 1 Samuel 15, we keep on reading. Don't just stop at 15. Keep going. We see David in chapter 30 engaging an Amalekite army. In fact, an army so large that 400 of them escape from David's clutches. So 1 Samuel 15 is talking about military engagement, and there are more soldiers even beyond that point whom David takes on. When we look at even the cities of Jericho, Ai, and other cities, these are actually not population centers. This is something that a lot of people do not recognize. But these are not places where the civilians would hang out. These were citadels or fortresses that guarded the hill country. And so before the civilians could be attacked in any way, you had these first lines of defense. Citadels like Jericho or Ai and other Canaanite cities that were to protect these civilians. So you had in these cities, these were centers where you'd have the kind of the military king, the person who was in charge of the military. You would have the religious leaders, the priests and so forth. You would have political rulers and so forth. But this was not the place where civilians would typically live. You might have a tavern keeper like Rahab, but that was the exception. That wasn't where the families typically stayed. And so when you get to these cities, these are, in fact, even Jericho itself was probably comprised maybe 100 or fewer soldiers. This was it. It wasn't this grand populated city that our children's storybooks, Bible storybooks tell us were there. But rather, these were more military installations. In fact, as you look at the pottery in these places, you don't see various kind of high social status ceramic pottery there. You just kind of see the run-of-the-mill pottery that was used by the military. It's very functional and so forth. So this is not the place where the range of the population stayed. In fact, some people say, well, doesn't it talk about thousands of people in a city like Jericho? Well, yes, the number that is used, Eleph, can sometimes be commonly rendered 1,000, but it can just simply mean unit or squad without specifying the specific number. And from what we know archaeologically, the numbers were quite small. We could also talk about how the Canaanites refused to acknowledge the one and true God. Another bullet point here. Rahab and her family were living demonstrations that the mission of killing the Canaanites was not absolute and irreversible, that God opened up the door for salvation for the Canaanites. Not that people took him up on the offer generally, but this was certainly available to people. In fact, Rahab herself becomes incorporated into the people of Israel, indicating that God is not concerned about wiping out Canaanites. He's happy to see Canaanites actually enter into a relationship with him, to become part of the people of God. Israel isn't engaged in a sort of genocide or ethnic cleansing by any stretch. In fact, later on, not only does Israel take in Rahab and her family, just as it would accept Ruth, but God is regularly reminding Israel to look out for the alien in their midst. Why? Because the Israelites had once been aliens and strangers in the land of Egypt. And what's also interesting is that God regularly threatens to judge Israel, just as he eventually did that, but he would judge them just as he did the Canaanites. In fact, Israel, when it is judged, the same language of extermination, of destruction, of wiping them out is used when they are going into exile. The same language is being used, but do we see that all the Israelites are totally annihilated when, say, Judah, when the Babylonians come in? No, we see large sectors going to Babylon, and we also see a large number of people staying behind. Again, nothing like the total annihilation that is often conjured up in the minds of people as they apply it to the Canaanites. Again, the same language that is used of the Canaanites being wiped out is the same language that is used of the Israelites being wiped out in exile. But we don't see literal extermination here. Another bullet point to keep in mind here is this: driving them out. The language of driving out the Canaanites predominates the biblical text from Exodus 23 onward. That you see that God is really not concerned about wiping out, but more driving out or displacing. And this language of driving out does not mean, oh, they're going to be annihilated. No, because Adam and Eve, the same word is used of their being driven out of Eden. David is driven out from the presence of Saul. Again, doesn't get killed, but is simply displaced or moved away. And so it's interesting that the language of driving them out is at odds with the language of utter destruction or obliteration. Expulsion is in view, not annihilation. And as John Goldingay, one Old Testament commentator, writes, he says, an attacked population wouldn't just wait around to be killed. Only the defenders who didn't get out would be the ones who would get killed. As Jeremiah 4:29 says, at the sound of the horsemen and the bowmen, every city flees. They go into the thickets and climb among the rocks. Every city is forsaken, and no man dwells in them. Richard Hess at Denver Seminary argues that we have no indications from the biblical text that the justified wars of Joshua were against non-combatants. Indeed, we read in Joshua and Judges that despite the obliteration language, there were plenty of Canaanite inhabitants who weren't driven out. Rather, they lived in areas where Israel had settled. And as we've seen, archaeology bears this out, that there was no massive military assault that took place against the Canaanites, but rather a gradual infiltration that took over 2 centuries to accomplish. Another point, we're told that Joshua destroys the Canaanites according to all that Moses had commanded. He utterly destroyed them just as Moses commanded. Joshua 11:12. Joshua captured all the cities of these kings and all their kings. He struck them with the edge of the sword and utterly destroyed them, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. Joshua 11:14 and 15. They left no one that breathed, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, the servant. So Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. And there's several texts that speak this way. So here Moses is saying, utterly destroy them, leave alive nothing that breathes. And then we read in Joshua that this is exactly what he does. He leaves alive nothing that breathes. The only problem is that there are a lot of Canaanites left alive breathing. So it's not as though Joshua is literally carrying this out, which must mean that Moses was not speaking in any literal way when he's talking about leave alive nothing that breathes. There was a very noteworthy language of hyperbole in the ancient Near East. And Joshua is one example of the many texts that could be brought to the surface to illustrate how this language of exaggeration is indeed utilized in war texts. So as we look at the question of what the scriptures say about the Canaanites, we see that it's far less clear, and I think far more encouraging as we look at this, these very troubling texts as we at least read some of them without reading the others to balance them out. We are left with another picture, aren't we? In fact, the skeptic cannot have it both ways. It's very interesting that the skeptic will say, well, how could God command this sort of a thing to happen? Well, okay, are you going to take that language literally? Or are you going to take the language of survivors literally? Because you have both. And you can't simply play one, the harsh text against the very clear text of survivors being left in great numbers. We could also ask the skeptic, does he believe that these things really happened, that the Israelites really did go into the land of Canaan, and that they really did bring a decisive military victory that basically obliterated the Canaanites in their midst? If the critic says, yes, I do believe that, well, archaeology is against him. Because archaeologically speaking, we don't have that. In fact, as I said, if we look at the biblical text more clearly, we don't see that dramatic military incursion, but we see a lot of inner tussle, a lot of infiltration, a lot of struggle, but not that decisive military conquest. Another question to ask, does the skeptic believe that Moses commanded the literal annihilation of the Canaanites? If so, then why do they not take it literally that Joshua obeyed all that Moses commanded, but still left lots of survivors? Does the skeptic believe that the Old Testament didn't use hyperbole and rhetoric in warfare texts? Well, then what does he do with clear indications of rhetorical exaggeration in other ancient Near East war texts where we clearly know that this was hyperbole, like the Moabite king who says that Israel is no more? So there are a number of points that we can rightfully bring up to the critic and say, well, if you're going to say this, if you're going to take this literally, well, what are you going to do with this? And so there are a number of questions that we can rightly ask of the critic. Now, let me just wrap up with a few final reflections. One of the things that is illustrated as we look at the Canaanite question is this: is God justified in bringing punishment to these Canaanites? Again, we've seen that it's really targeting Canaanite religion and morality rather than Canaanites themselves. That God is more interested in disabling the Canaanite structures than in removing, destroying the lives of Canaanites per se. As we look at this, we see that judgment is indeed central to this very motif of striking down the Canaanite religion. And this, of course, involves putting to death those who are upholding Canaanite religion and morality or immorality. Something that would be, again, it's a just punishment for the Canaanites who are engaging in this and refuse to repent, but it's also preparing the way for the coming of the Messiah. But in our language, in our society, we don't really think of the language of judgment as being appropriate. But I think it's helpful to round out our time before we get to the question and answer time to quote the Yale theologian Miroslav Volf, who was born in Croatia and lived through the nightmare years of ethnic strife in the former Yugoslavia, including the destruction of churches, the rape of women, the murder of innocents. And he, at one point as a young theologian, thought that wrath and anger were beneath the dignity of God. But he came to realize that his view of God had been too low. Here, this is Volf. He puts into perspective the complaints about divine wrath and judgment. He said, I used to think that wrath was unworthy of God. Isn't God love? Shouldn't divine love be beyond wrath? God is love, and God loves every person and every creature. That's exactly why God is wrathful against some of them. My last resistance to the idea of God's wrath was a casualty of the war in the former Yugoslavia, the region from which I come. According to some estimates, 200,000 people were killed, and over 3 million were displaced. My villages and cities were destroyed, my people shelled day in and day out, some of them brutalized beyond imagination, and I could not imagine God not being angry. Or think of Rwanda in the last decade of the past century, where 800,000 people were hacked to death in 100 days. How did God react to the carnage? By doting on the perpetrators in a grandfatherly fashion? By refusing to condemn the bloodbath, but instead affirming the perpetrators' basic goodness? Wasn't God fiercely angry with them? Though I used to complain about the indecency of the idea of God's wrath, I came to think that I would have to rebel against a God who wasn't wrathful at the sight of the world's evil. God isn't wrathful in spite of being love. God is wrathful because God is love.